The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council was a monument to order, logic, and the illusion of absolute control. Towering columns of light stretched upward into a vaulted ceiling that shimmered like the fabric of space itself. The most powerful beings in the galaxy sat in their respective seats, hovering platforms arranged in a perfect circle, ensuring that no one species appeared dominant over another. Today's session had been expected to focus on trade disputes and territorial negotiations, but it had taken a different turn, one that filled the chamber with quiet amusement. At the center of the room, a Zorvath warlord stood, his crimson armor reflecting the artificial glow of the Council's High Court. He was General Vork, a veteran of 100 campaigns, a conqueror whose fleets had crushed civilizations deemed far greater than humanity. His golden eyes scanned the assembled representatives, his voice a deep growl laced with amusement. "The humans," he said, letting the word hang in the air for a moment. "They claim they have a weapon beyond all comprehension, a technology that can rewrite the battlefield itself." His lip curled, revealing serrated fangs. "They call it the Singularity Wave." The laughter that followed was not cruel, nor was it particularly loud. It was the laughter of scholars humoring a child, the collective amusement of an empire that had seen it all before. Representatives from the collection hive clicked their mandibles in a gesture of disbelief, while the long-lived HFY, their bioluminescent forms pulsing in shades of amusement, shared knowing glances. "This is not the first time a young species has claimed to hold the key to ultimate power," said a council elder, his voice slow and deliberate. He was a Korthan, a race that had recorded the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Every cycle, we hear such proclamations, and every cycle, they amount to nothing. A new voice entered the conversation, smooth and confident. It belonged to a Yalethi diplomat, one of the most influential members of the council. "The laws of physics do not bend to human ambition," she said. "They are absolute, immutable." She turned her golden gaze toward Vork. "And what does the Zorvath Empire say to these claims? Are they concerned?" Vork chuckled. "Concerned? No." He let the word linger. "Intrigued? Yes." He took a slow step forward, his armor humming with latent energy. "The humans have spirit. I will give them that. But they are mistaken if they believe they can defy the natural order. The Singularity Wave is nothing more than a fantasy, an impossible dream." The council murmured in agreement. If humanity had truly developed such a weapon, surely it would have been detected. The Zorvath had already begun their invasion of human space, meeting only token resistance. If this so-called ultimate weapon existed, it would have been deployed by now. Vork's expression darkened, amusement giving way to certainty. The humans will fall. Their worlds will burn. And when they beg for mercy, they will understand one truth. He leaned forward, voice low but unmistakably final. "There is no such thing as the impossible." The skies above Kesera 4 burned. Once a thriving human colony, its towering cities now lay in ruins, their skeletal remains jutting from the earth like shattered bones. Smoke billowed into the atmosphere, choking out the sun, casting the land into a permanent twilight of fire and ash. The Zorvath war machine had arrived in full force, their warships blotting out the sky as precision strikes erased centuries of human progress in mere hours. From the wreckage of a collapsed building, Lieutenant Marcus Hale dragged himself free, his body aching from the impact of the shockwave that had sent him tumbling through debris. His HUD flickered erratically, half his visor cracked, distorting his view of the devastation around him. Somewhere in the distance, automated distress beacons pulsed weakly, their signals lost in the static of overwhelming interference. He tapped at his communicator, knowing full well that no reinforcements were coming. Kesera 4 was lost. Overhead, Zorvath dropships descended in coordinated patterns, their hulls gleaming with alien alloys that humanity had yet to fully comprehend. The creatures within were not mindless brutes. The Zorvath did not conquer with sheer force alone. They dismantled civilizations with cold efficiency. Tactical strikes disabled defenses before resistance could even form. Communication hubs were destroyed in the opening salvos. Escape routes were cut off. The invasion was not a battle. It was a process, and humanity was being processed. Hale pushed himself up, adrenaline forcing his body into motion. A few meters away, Sergeant Rivera coughed violently, her armor dented and scorched from a near miss. He pulled her to her feet as the sound of marching boots echoed through the ruined streets. Zorvath enforcers, clad in segmented armor designed for both combat and intimidation, moved methodically through the wreckage. Their weapons hummed with barely contained energy, scanning for survivors, executing any who resisted. "We need to move," Hale whispered. Rivera wiped blood from her lip and nodded. Together, they slipped into the shadows, ducking behind the remains of a transport vehicle as the patrol passed by. Nearby, a civilian transport lay half-buried in rubble, its passengers still strapped into their seats, unmoving. No screams, no sounds of suffering, just silence. Command knew this was coming, Rivera muttered bitterly as they crept through the ruins. They knew, and they let it happen. Hale didn't respond. He had read the reports. Every human leader had known the Zorvath would come. But when the Council refused to intervene, when humanity's supposed allies turned their backs, what options had remained? Their fleets had been outmatched. Their weapons were obsolete against the sheer technological superiority of the Zorvath. And yet there had been whispers. Whispers of something buried deep within the colonies. A last-ditch effort. A forbidden experiment that defied all logic. A weapon. A myth. Hale wasn't sure he believed it. But if there was even a chance that humanity had something left, something that could turn the tide, he knew one thing for certain. He had to survive long enough to see it unleashed. Beneath the icy surface of Titan, humanity's most secretive project was nearing its final stages. The research facility, built deep into the moon's subterranean caverns, had been designed with one purpose: to push the boundaries of human science, to create the impossible. The facility was a complex of steel and concrete, shrouded in secrecy, shielded by layers of encryption and deception. No one outside this small circle of scientists and military personnel knew the truth. Humanity had been working on a weapon that could defy the very laws of nature. Inside the facility, Dr. Emily Sampson, the lead scientist of the Singularity Wave Project, paced anxiously in front of a holographic display. The calculations were incomplete, the system unstable. Every test they had run so far had ended in failure, catastrophic failures that nearly tore the facility apart. The Singularity Wave, when activated, would harness energy on a scale never before seen, a force that could manipulate the very fabric of space-time. It could create black holes, distort gravity, and alter reality itself. It was humanity's last, desperate gamble against extinction. "This isn't ready," Dr. Sampson muttered to herself, wiping sweat from her brow. The air in the room was thick, humid with the weight of impending disaster. "We're asking for a miracle." Behind her, a voice interrupted. "We don't have time for miracles, Emily. We need a solution. Now." It was Commander Jacob Ford, the military leader assigned to oversee the project. He had been with them from the beginning. A man who understood that sometimes the difference between life and death wasn't a decision. It was a singular moment of action. "We have no other choice," he continued, his voice firm. "The Zorvath are tearing through human space. The Council has abandoned us. There's no one left to help. If this works, we stop them. If it doesn't, well, we die trying." Sampson turned toward him, her face grim. "I know the stakes, Jacob. But if this fails, the damage could be irreversible. We could destroy everything we've worked for." Ford met her gaze with unflinching determination. "Or we could win, and everything we've lost will mean something." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Every scientist, every technician in the room had heard the rumors, the stories about the Singularity Wave. To some, it was a mythical weapon, a science fiction fantasy. To others, It was an abomination, a forbidden force that no one, no matter how desperate, should ever dare to unleash. But for those who worked in the shadows of Titan, the weapon was their last hope. "Initiate final protocol," Samson finally said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her mind. She had no illusions about the risks. But the stakes had never been higher. Around the room, technicians moved with purpose, activating the system. A massive core in the center of the facility began to hum, its immense energy resonating through the metal walls. The gravitational generators powered up, and the resonating pulses filled the air with an almost otherworldly vibration. The Singularity device had been built from the very cutting edge of human understanding, its foundation rooted in theories and experiments that stretched the limits of imagination. Ford stood by Samson's side, watching as the readouts flashed across the screen. "This better work," he muttered. "One way to find out," Samson replied, her fingers hovering over the final activation sequence. With a deep breath, she pressed the button. The Singularity wave was unleashed. Titan's surface trembled as the pulse of energy from the Singularity wave shot upward, tearing through the crust of the moon and surging into space. The facility's massive underground generators roared to life, pushing unimaginable amounts of power into the heart of the device. For a split second, the atmosphere above the research base flickered, as if reality itself was bending and stretching in response to the catastrophic force being unleashed. In the command center, Dr. Sampson stared at the readouts in disbelief. The Singularity wave was active. Its energy levels were off the charts. She had expected some instability, but this was beyond anything they had anticipated. The force generated was so intense, the facility's structural integrity began to fail. Large cracks spread along the walls, and the floor beneath them groaned as if the very planet itself were shuddering at the creation of such a thing. "Abort the sequence. It's too much," a voice yelled from across the room. It was one of the technicians, his face pale as he tried to disconnect the system. But it was too late. The wave had been triggered, and there was no going back. Ford, who had been watching the operation from the back of the command center, felt the weight of the moment. His gut twisted with the gnawing realization that they were no longer in control. "Is it working?" he barked at Samson, his voice sharp. She hesitated. "Aye." The building shook violently, throwing everyone to the floor as another explosion rumbled through the facility. The Singularity wave had created an anomaly in the planet's magnetic field, triggering a chain reaction that destabilized Titan's atmosphere. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging them into darkness. For a moment, everything felt still. And then the sound of the explosion reached them. It was not a physical blast, but something far more ominous, a deep, resonant hum, like the entire moon itself was beginning to collapse into a black hole. The shockwave from the wave rippled outward, and in that instant, the last thing they saw before the darkness swallowed them was the projection of space folding in on itself, as if the entire universe was warping to make room for something new. Outside, the Zorvath fleet, now hovering above Titan, began to experience its own effects. The first wave of Zorvath warships that had dropped onto the surface of Titan found themselves caught in an impossible situation. Their ships, designed to withstand almost any force, now shook as gravity itself fluctuated around them. A violent distortion ripped through space, and the first ship, massive, invulnerable, and thought impervious, vanished into the void. Captain Zorok, a seasoned Zorvath commander, watched in stunned horror as his fleet was slowly ripped apart. His advanced sensors registered the anomaly too late. The gravitational field had grown too unstable. Their technology, once thought unbeatable, was no match for the newly born weapon of humanity. "Impossible," Zorok growled under his breath, his reptilian eyes widening as his own ship was torn from its position, hurtling into deep space. It was as if the very fabric of space-time had unraveled, swallowing whole ships in seconds, leaving nothing behind but the echo of destruction. Back on Titan, the ground was shaking so violently that the building seemed to twist and groan under the pressure. Samson staggered to her feet, panic starting to set in. The weapon was too powerful, too unpredictable. But just as she thought they were about to be torn apart, everything stopped. The distortion in space, the singularity, collapsed in on itself, and for the first time since the wave was unleashed, Titan's surface fell silent. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air like an oppressive fog. The weapon had done its job. It had worked. It was impossible. Until it wasn't. The silence that followed the singularity wave's release was deafening. For a long moment, no one spoke, no one moved. On Titan's surface, the atmosphere had stabilized, but the ground was scared, as if the very fabric of reality had been stretched and torn apart. In the depths of the research facility, Dr. Sampson and Commander Ford stood in stunned silence, both aware that they had just crossed a threshold that no human had ever dared to approach. The walls, once pristine and reinforced to withstand even the harshest conditions, were now cracked and crumbling, their structure unable to hold up against the violent forces that had erupted from the core. And yet, in the midst of the devastation, there was a strange peace, a stillness that signified the weapon had done its work. Samson's trembling fingers hovered over the console, watching the redouts that flickered erratically, confirming that the singularity wave had not only been unleashed, but had reached its maximum potential. The raw, untamable force was now spreading outward, twisting the space around it, erasing everything in its path. What did we just do? Ford's voice was hoarse, as if the weight of the moment was beginning to sink in. His eyes, wide and filled with disbelief, were fixed on the screen. "Something we'll never fully understand," Samson replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She wiped her brow, her heart pounding in her chest. The singularity wave had been designed to be humanity's ultimate weapon, but it was so much more than they had ever imagined. As the seconds ticked by, the facility's emergency alarms began blaring, signaling that the energy levels had exceeded safe thresholds. The gravitational instability was spreading out into space, pulling everything into its invisible web. The first signs of the effect were immediate. Zorvath ships, vast war machines that had been closing in on Titan, began to disappear from the scanners, as if the universe had swallowed them whole. In the distance, Ford could barely comprehend what he was seeing. The Zorvath Armada, once a seemingly invincible force, was now nothing more than shattered fragments of debris drifting in every direction. Ships that had once been capable of destroying entire fleets were torn apart by forces they had never before encountered. Some vessels were crushed by sudden, violent bursts of gravitational pressure, while others were flung into the void light years away from their original positions. The sheer magnitude of the power humanity had unlocked was impossible to comprehend. Is this real?" Ford asked again, his voice rising in disbelief. Samson didn't answer. She didn't need to. The view from the command center spoke for itself. Titan had just rewritten the rules of warfare. The singularity wave wasn't a weapon. It was a force of nature. And it had just altered the balance of power in the galaxy. Back on Earth, humanity had watched with bated breath as the first signs of the wave's activation had been broadcast. Military personnel, scientists, and even civilians held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. But now, as reports flooded in of the Zorvath Armada's complete annihilation, something else began to spread. Hope. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, humanity had something the rest of the galaxy feared. Not a weapon, but a reality-altering force that could undo their oppressors. No longer the underdogs, no longer weak or insignificant. Humanity had been written off by the Galactic Council, laughed at by the greatest civilizations in the galaxy. But now, the galaxy had no choice but to pay attention. And as the first reports of the weapon's success spread across the stars, one truth became clear. Humanity had just proven the impossible was, in fact, possible. News of the singularity wave's devastating success spread like wildfire throughout the galaxy. It wasn't just the Zorvath fleet that had been shattered. It was the very foundation of the galaxy's power structures that had been rocked to their core. The sheer scale of humanity's new weapon was incomprehensible. No longer were they the insignificant species, the primitive race that the Galactic Council had dismissed for so long. No, now humanity was a force to be reckoned with. The first reactions were disbelief, shock even. How had this small, young species created something that defied the fundamental laws of the universe? How had they harnessed such unimaginable power in the first place? Rumors spread across the stars, the whispers of a forbidden experiment, a myth turned reality. Some were in awe of the human ingenuity, while others, particularly those who had once viewed humanity as a resource to be exploited, were filled with dread. In the grand chambers of the Galactic Council, representatives from every corner of the galaxy gathered for an emergency session. The once calm, organized discussions were replaced with urgent, frenzied debates. The normally composed council members found themselves out of their depth, unsure of how to react to the overwhelming force humanity had just unleashed. How did they do it? Asked a high-ranking collection official, his many eyes blinking rapidly in agitation. How did they bypass the laws of physics? An HFY diplomat, his bioluminescent skin glowing a dull green, responded cautiously, "No species has ever dared to manipulate the fabric of space-time like this. This is an existential threat to every galactic power." A Zorvath emissary, still reeling from the loss of the war fleet, slammed a fist onto the table. "We are humiliated. Our warriors are gone, obliterated by a force we cannot comprehend. The humans have awakened something unnatural." The council elder, a Korthan of ancient lineage, spoke slowly, his voice deep and rumbling. "The question is not how they did it, but what happens next. If the humans can harness such power, what other forces can they bring to bear? We have always believed that such weapons were beyond the reach of any species. No one would dare to unlock them. But the humans have done just that." Fear settled over the chamber. What had once been a strategic advantage, being the most advanced and militarily dominant species in the galaxy, was now in jeopardy. If humanity's weapon was real, if it could be replicated or even improved upon, then the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted. No longer would the Galactic Council be the ones calling the shots. Humanity now held the keys to a future no one could predict. Elsewhere, across the galaxy, smaller species began to act. Some sought to ally with humanity, seeing an opportunity to break free from the established hierarchies that had kept them subjugated. There were those, however, who saw the rise of humanity as a threat too great to ignore. The Tsark, a race of technologically advanced cephalopods, began to forge secret alliances, pooling resources to create countermeasures. The Rican, a warlike species known for their brutal conquests, began preparing for their own response, training elite warriors for a potential conflict. And then there were the factions within the Galactic Council who began to plot in the shadows. They had always known that humanity was unpredictable, and now that unpredictability had become the most dangerous element in the galaxy. They couldn't allow this power to remain unchecked, no matter the cost. Some saw a threat to their own power. Others simply feared that if humanity was left unchecked, they might rewrite the future in their own image. For the first time, humanity's enemies were united by one singular purpose: to ensure that the singularity wave and the terrifying possibility of what humanity could do next was contained, and it was this shared fear that would set the stage for the next chapter of the galaxy's tumultuous history. The future, it seemed, was now uncertain. The impossible had been done, and the universe was left to wonder. Could humanity control such power, or would they become the architects of their own undoing? The galaxy's response to humanity's newfound power was swift and unrelenting. The Council, already divided, now found itself at the brink of total collapse. Some factions had called for an immediate alliance with humanity, recognizing their potential as a powerful ally against other, more aggressive species. But the majority, driven by fear and a desire to retain control began to mobilize their forces for a counterattack. The specter of the Singularity Wave, a force that could wipe out entire fleets and destabilize planets, hung over them like a looming shadow. Within the space of a few weeks, covert operations were underway across the galaxy. Intelligence networks from several species, led by the Tark and Rican, joined forces to develop countermeasures. The Zorvath, still reeling from their catastrophic defeat at Titan, had begun to regroup, their leaders vowing vengeance on humanity for the humiliation they had suffered. The Zorvath warlords, known for their brutal efficiency, were not ones to let such an affront go unanswered. They would not allow a lesser species to reshape the galaxy in their image. At the heart of the military buildup stood an ominous force, the Korthan Empire. Their long-standing philosophy of domination and subjugation had earned them a reputation as one of the most ruthless factions in the galaxy. The Korthan Empire had spent centuries perfecting their own weapons, cloaking technologies, antimatter cannons, and gravitational warheads. But nothing they had prepared could match the raw, unbridled power of the Singularity Wave. Still, the Korthan were not ones to bow before any threat. They were prepared to strike first, to develop a counter-weapon, no matter the cost. Back on Earth, humanity had quickly become aware of the growing tensions. While many civilians celebrated the success of the Singularity Wave as a miracle, the higher-ups in military command knew better. The rest of the galaxy had already begun preparing for the worst, and soon, humanity's fate would be decided in a conflict that would reshape everything. In the underground command center, General Sarah Hayes, a seasoned strategist, stood before a vast holographic display showing the movements of enemy fleets across the galaxy. Their ships were methodically advancing, gathering in pockets of space that humanity had once considered safe. The generals of Earth's combined military forces had convened for an emergency meeting to discuss their next steps. "They're coming," General Hayes said, her voice cold and firm. "We know they'll be prepared, but they won't expect us to be this ready. The Singularity Wave is just the beginning. We have the technology. We have the momentum." Admiral James Ackerman, the head of Earth's Navy, was next to speak. "We've created our own countermeasures, General. If the enemy comes at us with the same intensity they did on Titan, we'll be ready. Our new energy shields, combined with the antimatter missiles we've developed, will provide a formidable defense." Hayes nodded. "But it's not just about defense. If we want to survive, we need to go on the offensive. We cannot let them believe they have the upper hand. We need to make our move now, before they finish their preparations." The room was silent for a moment, as everyone absorbed the gravity of her words. Humanity was not only facing extinction, they were about to become the center of an all-out war between the most powerful factions the galaxy had ever known. The Singularity Wave had been their weapon, but now it was humanity's resolve and cunning that would need to win the day. "What's the plan?" asked Captain Alicia Brooks, a rising star in the fleet, her eyes burning with determination. "We strike first," Hayes said, turning toward the tactical map. "We've detected weak points in the Korthan and Zorvath fleets. We use everything we have, our new technology, our combat experience, to hit them hard and fast. We make them fear us." As the meeting continued, preparations for the counteroffensive accelerated. The weight of the decision was clear. Humanity had come from the brink of annihilation to being the very thing that the galaxy feared. But in this moment of crisis, they had one undeniable advantage: their willingness to fight, to adapt, and to do whatever it took to ensure their survival. Outside, the stars had already begun to shift. The counterattack had begun. The galaxy would soon know that humanity was no longer just a force to be reckoned with. They were a force to be feared. The battle for the galaxy had begun, and humanity was no longer on the defensive. The first wave of Earth's counteroffensive had struck hard and fast, catching the Zorvath and Korthan forces off guard. They had underestimated humanity's resolve, their ability to adapt, and the strength of their will to survive. Now, with each new strike, the galaxy began to shift, slowly but inexorably, toward a new order. Humanity's fleet had evolved beyond the simple ships and weapons of the past. The technology developed in the aftermath of the singularity wave had provided them with an arsenal of unimaginable power. Energy shields capable of deflecting even the most potent strikes, antimatter warheads designed to obliterate entire fleets, and quantum drives that allowed ships to maneuver in ways previously thought impossible. These new tools, combined with their ingenuity and resourcefulness, had turned the tide of war in their favor. But it wasn't just the advanced technology that set humanity apart. It was their strategy, their understanding of how to fight with purpose, how to win without sacrificing everything. They fought not just for survival, but for something greater. Their place in the galaxy, the freedom to define their own future. And they fought with a unity that none of their enemies could match. On the front lines, the human fleet was making its way toward the heart of Korthan territory. A massive battle had been scheduled, one that would decide the fate of the galaxy. The Korthan warlords, leaders of an empire that had once been unbeatable, were preparing for their final stand. The warships were lined up in a vast formation, their engines primed and ready. But what they hadn't anticipated was the speed and precision with which humanity's forces were closing in. General Sarah Hayes stood at the bridge of the flagship, her eyes fixed on the tactical display. The Korthan fleet was massive, but they were slow. The Korthan had always relied on overwhelming force and brute strength, but now they were facing an enemy that was agile, unpredictable, and willing to use every weapon at their disposal. Humanity's ships darted in and out of the enemy formations, striking with surgical precision, crippling key targets before the Korthan could mount any kind of effective counterattack. "Target their command ships," Hayes ordered, her voice calm and authoritative. "Take out their leadership. The rest will fall into disarray." The fleet responded without hesitation. Dozens of ships surged forward, unleashing a torrent of firepower that shattered the Korthan defenses. The battle raged on, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The once invincible Korthan warlords were now fighting for their survival, their fleets crumbling under the relentless assault of humanity's forces. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the unimaginable happened. The Korthan flagship, a behemoth of engineering and power, was struck by a single, precise antimatter missile. The explosion was catastrophic, sending shockwaves through the remaining Korthan fleet. The Korthan had lost their command, and with it, their will to fight. The remainder of their forces surrendered or fled, leaving humanity victorious. The news of the Korthan defeat spread quickly across the galaxy, sending ripples of shock and awe through every faction. The Zorveth, once so confident in their superiority, began to rethink their position. The Tsark and Rikan, who had been preparing for their own counteroffensive, now saw humanity as an equal, a new force to be reckoned with. And the Galactic Council, once so dismissive of humanity's potential, found themselves with no choice but to sit at the negotiating table. Humanity had won. They had proven that the impossible could be done, that they were no longer just a species to be ignored or underestimated. The galaxy had been forced to acknowledge the power of the singularity wave, but more than that, they had been forced to recognize the power of humanity itself. As the dust settled and the first peace talks began, General Hayes stood on the deck of the flagship, looking out at the stars. The galaxy was no longer the same. Humanity had changed the course of history, and now they would decide their own future. No longer a species on the brink of annihilation, humanity had risen to become the true masters of their destiny. The dawn of a new era had begun.